No mai haere mai, ko Joy Keene toka ingoa, ko o te rangatira te ropu, waihanga kimu o Aotearoa. Hello and welcome to the slightly different format of webinar for NZGDA. I'm Joy Keene, the Executive Director of NZGDA, and today I'm having a fireside chat with Tamara Buckland from Bloom HQ, who is also the producer of the Wellbeing Deck. So welcome, Tamara. How are you?
Kia ora. Well, thank you for having me. It's really amazing to be here. I'm well, I'm good, and I'm excited to talk about well-being stuff in the context of the gaming industry. Yeah, really cool.
Excellent. So the Wellbeing Deck, which I just mentioned, you are the producer of. Tell us about the Wellbeing Deck. How did it? Tell me about the Wellbeing Deck and how it came to be.
Yeah, so the Wellbeing Deck is a game that's designed for workplaces. Well, not actually not just workplaces, for anybody. A lot of families and individuals use it as well. But it came about quite a few years ago when I was actually having some challenges with my own mental health. So essentially, I'll cut the story down a little bit because it's a bit long. But essentially, a few years ago, I was working in a tech company in Wellington and was got massively burnt out. Ended up quitting and then being off work for quite some time because of burnout. But I had quite severe depression. Part of that experience was that I sort of, I guess I became sort of non-verbal, or I found it quite difficult to articulate my needs. And so one day I was just sitting there and I was like, oh, I really want to do something for myself. And my partner was going, oh, could see that I wasn't feeling that well that day and was like, what should we do? And I was like, you know what? The next time I'm well, I'm going to go and write down a list of things that I can do to support my mental health. And then that way, if we get into this situation again, where I'm like not sure of how to support myself and he's not sure of how to support me, we can just pull out this list and go and do something on the list. So that's exactly what happened. So I wrote some things on some post-it notes, one of them being go and look at the stars, which is one of my favorite things to do. And so I did that for a while. And as it happened, me and the Jeremy, who's the owner of Riders and Elephants, who publishes this deck, he and I were already connected. And one day I was telling him about this experience I was having and the fact that I'd written down all these bits and stuff. And he's like, that could be a deck of cards. That could be a deck that's similar to his other deck, because he has a deck called the Emotional Culture Deck. And we thought, let's do it. So I think it took something like 4 years to produce. And I think anyone who makes games, whether they're card games or video games or whatever games, knows that some of those processes take longer than you think. And over the course of 4 years, we tested it, iterated on it many times. I've got so many different iterations of this game. And a few years ago, it was put out into the world. And so essentially, it's a very it's made from a very, very deeply personal experience. And now it's all around the world. There's practitioners all around the world using this deck of cards to help their teams, their workplaces, their families to better understand their well-being in a similar way that I did back when I was unwell, and then help put plans in place to help them with that. So that's essentially what it is. That's the origin story, and it's evolved a lot since then. And mostly, it's everybody who plays it on a regular basis comes up with all these amazing ways of using it. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Excellent. And a word that you've said a few times there, and we really need to clarify, this is a card game, isn't it? It's not a presentation deck that you have to go through. It's actually a card game.
It is a game, yeah. And I think when there's a real strategic reason, like, so it's got the kind of basic mechanics of a game, in a sense, where you've got steps and you've got things you need to do, and ways you can play it, and so it's got some of the formulas of a game. It's also very strategic to call it a game. When we talk about well-being, sometimes it's this big scary thing that people come in and do this big presentation about, all this big topic that feels kind of not very approachable. And so the reason why we always introduce it as a game, even if it doesn't feel like a traditional game, because it's not like it's not like super fun or like win or anything. It could be fun, but it's because it also lightens the way in which we think about it, and people are more likely, this has been played by people who would traditionally never talk about their feelings, but because it's in this game format, suddenly people open up, and it's pretty incredible for that reason. So it's a very strategic move to also really emphasize its game mechanics, because it just, it really helps people open up in ways you'd never expect.
Sure. And I think another unique part of this game is what I did was I played it with myself, but you can also play it with a team of people.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting from a manager's point of view of being able to put everybody through an experience where they become supportive. Is that part of the reason why you recommend doing it as a team as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do not, well, I know we do not talk about well-being enough in our workplaces. And even though it's been like a bit of a fad or a bit of a trend, to talk about well-being, a lot of that stuff is not actually that deeply personal, individual, and which means it doesn't really stick. And so when we do this in team environments, what we're doing, as well as the steps themselves, encourage you to think about what your own well-being needs are and then share with your team. So the more your team know about you, as much as you want to disclose, obviously, the more they can help. Because sometimes, I mean, you might know this as well, but like sometimes my friends or the people closest to me are the first people to notice when I'm not very well. And so if we can do this in a team environment where everybody's kind of hearing what works well for them, or what a bad day looks like for them, or whatever, then they're going to be the ones that go, hey, hang on a minute, you said that when you're not feeling well you get quite withdrawn, and I've noticed you're not showing up to social events. What's going on? The conversation gets a whole lot more natural, and we're more likely to ask. And to be honest, I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do in our workplaces. We're so afraid to ask people how they truly, truly are. But if we're creating an environment where that's actually expected because we've all shared, then reaching out becomes so much easier, and it's really, really effective.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And from my own experience, I ran a team that was full of quite diverse people, and I always said to them when they first started with me, I'm going to ask you one day how you are, and you're going to tell me you're good, even though you're not. So when I say to you now, how are you really? I'm inviting you to tell me how you are in a safe place, in a safe way.
Yep.
And what that did was it actually gave my staff the permission, I suppose you'd say, to tell me anything, to say, look, shit, I need out of here for half an hour, or look, I'm really struggling with something, this is happening in my life. And by doing that, they got to speak it, part of letting it out.
Yeah.
And I could also say to them, well, shit, mate, go and take a week, go and take a day, do whatever you need to do. And the team started learning everybody else's signals that something was going on. And it was a really, really great environment, a great culture, because we all became quite intimate with the way we were feeling and the way we were dealing with workloads or pressures or life things. And it was really, really good. And I've continued to do that since that experience. And the crises that I think we have managed to avoid has been really good, because I've taken that approach with my team to make sure that, hey, they come to work every day. They spend more time at work than they do at home with their families in a week. So why would we not want to be supportive like somebody would be in their own home? Yeah,
Absolutely. I love
that's
that. Yeah, I love that. And sometimes you do have to ask, like, I love that thing of like, how are you really? Because I think
yeah.
that really stops people in their tracks, and that's great.
It does. And it was a good cue to give everybody, because, when I say now, how are you really? They know that I'm not buying that, I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so sometimes
Yep.
I would get it wrong, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
I'd just get it wrong and they'd go, no, 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 I'm all good,
Yeah.
which was fine. But it also gave them that permission to
Yeah.
tell me about it. So
Yeah.
step us through the well-being deck and how the game is played.
Yeah, great. I will do. Well, I've got the game in front of me, so I'm just going to refer to that. Essentially, there's like I think there's 6 steps. You'd think I'd know this off by heart. But essentially, so there's the idea with the end of this, if you run the game through in its like order that it says on the tin, you end up with a wellbeing plan. So you end up walking away with a plan of like that maps out a bunch of these different things. There are heaps of other ways to play it, but I'll take you through the main way. So the first step is that we talk about our ideal state. So this is all about understanding what it looks like when we're thriving. And so we ask people, the question that we always ask people is, when I'm thriving, I feel. And when, I'm just picking these cards up here, then they've got all these kind of cards to choose from here with different, gosh, I don't know if that's going to turn up backwards or not, but anyway, there's all these feelings words on these cards. So basically, you sort through them and you find your top 5 feelings that best answer the question, when I'm thriving, I feel. And the great thing about doing this is that you could ask that question without these cards, definitely. But in my experience, we do not use these kind of feelings words in day-to-day life, and these are much more descriptive. So that's the kind of beauty of doing it this way, is that you actually get way more specific, which is going to help you in a later step. So that's the first step. We map out our ideal state, and then we talk about it with whoever we're doing it with, or if we're doing it on our own, well, we can talk to ourselves if we want, but otherwise we write it down and we move to the next step. So the next step is low points, and very similar to the thriving state, we're doing the same sort of activity, but this time we're looking at what it feels like when we're low. So we cast our mind back to a time that we felt low, if it's not right now, and we think about, how did it feel at that time? So when I'm at a low point, I feel ... We pick up these cards, and these cards also have more feelings words on them, but there are the more undesired feelings cards. We do the same thing. We pick 5 of those. Similar vibe in that we're trying to get very specific here about the feelings. The reason why we do this part first, this is about mapping those feelings at both the thriving end and the low end. The reason we do that is because, again, as I said earlier, it actually can be quite hard for us to spot ourselves when we're not feeling particularly well. But if we name the specific feelings, we can actually cast our eye on our plan and go, actually, I have started feeling a bit withdrawn or a bit lonely. Those are very specific feelings. That means I might need to get some support, or I'm feeling quite joyful at the moment. Joy, you might be feeling joyful all the time. I'm not sure. Some funny joke there. But we get to then notice that too, because sometimes even as Kiwis, we're not very good at also noticing when we're doing very well and celebrating that. So it's really important to do that. Cool. So the next step is influences. Now, a card was originally called triggers, but so in some ways it's a little bit interchangeable, but influences feels a little bit more appropriate for the workplace. And this is all about things that may influence our low points. So for example, and then we pick up these cards and choose whatever ones of these cards contribute to the low points that we've already chosen, the low feelings. So this one's deadlines, fear of failure. There's quite a few things in there. You can choose as many as you want. Now, this step's all about helping to notice patterns. And sometimes when I do this in a work context, I will also name that some of these things aren't applicable in the workplace, but there's some other things. So then we'll do a collaborative brainstorm on like, what other things in our specific work environment might be influencing that? So maybe we've just gone through a restructure. Well, that's probably influencing our low points, right? Because that's kind of hard. So there could be all sorts of things that might contribute to that. So it's the third step. The fourth step is practices. So this is my favorite step because we get to now talk about what we're going to do about how we're feeling. Like, so when we're feeling low, what things might we do to support that? And when we're thriving, what things might we do to continue helping us thrive? So things like there's dance and there's all sorts of things in here. Learn something new. And of course, these are just some ideas. So it's, a basis from which to, create your own stuff from. But the idea here is to notice how many things in our lives that we've got that can support us in our well-being, because sometimes we go, no, there's nothing I can do. Especially when we're low, we're like, oh no, everything sucks. But if we can do this exercise and remember that maybe just spending time with animals, for example, really helps us, well, why don't we go and find one if we don't have one? Or, like it triggers a little bit of a thing in our brain. No, actually, no, I do like that. I can go and do that.
Mm.
The fifth step is all about critical moves. That's where we kind of start narrowing down our focus. So really we're taking our practices and we're getting like really clear, what are the actual things we're going to do from here? So that's about creating a plan. And then the sixth step is about reflections, like what did we learn about ourselves? And it's always important to do reflection at the end of an activity like this to see not only how did I feel in this actual activity, but what are the things underlying this that I may have picked up on about myself that's worth noting. So that's the end-to-end process. Sounds a bit long-winded, but so many ways of doing it, as you can imagine. Yeah.
And so the output that you get from it is really an overview of, and please correct me if I'm wrong, an overview of this is how I feel when I'm good, this is how I feel when I'm bad. These are things that make me feel better when I'm feeling bad. So that you can have like a wee checklist somewhere that tells you
Totally.
if you're feeling like this, then go and do that activity. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. One thing that I haven't mentioned is that but I haven't mentioned this because I think it's very like when you buy this deck of cards, and I'm not suggesting for a minute you have to buy these cards, although please do if you want to. But it comes with this well-being plan. I wish I had one to show you. I don't usually keep them in this office, but it's essentially a plan which maps every single one of those steps out. So people physically fill out that plan. I've seen these people and like put it in their bag and carry it around with them, so then they can pick it up and look at it. But because I'm also trying to be a little bit like game agnostic here, because you could do this, there's also a free version of this, but you can just write this down in a notebook and make a list of things, right? So there's many ways in which you can capture this, just because I don't want you to force you to buy anything in particular. But yes, yeah, the idea is you walk away with something written that you can use.
Yeah, that's excellent. And again, drawing on my own experience, I actually used to have a list that was made, gosh, maybe 20, 25 years ago of things that I can do to make myself feel better when I'm feeling low. And I still have that today. It used to be stuck to my monitor. First it was my bedroom mirror, then it was on my monitor, and it's now something that's locked in the back of my head. And it was really interesting when I played the wellbeing deck that a lot of those things from way back then was still appropriate.
Cool.
But there was also a whole pile of new things that I discovered that I could also do through the wellbeing deck. So that leads me to my next question. How often should we be playing the wellbeing deck?
Yeah, great question. That really depends. That full end-to-end process, I think, like in my experience, the last few years just doing this with a lot of different people, I think quarterly is a really good way, because I think we do change more often than we think, in terms of like what we want to do, and we just need to keep that fresh. So I like to play it quarterly, because I think it gives you a new perspective, even if you end up with the same cards. And there have been times when I've ended up with the same exact things completely independently, which is good. That's also a good thing to notice, because that tells me something, right? That tells me that these things are very definitely important to me and I need to do them. So I think doing it quarterly as a whole game. But I would also say that there's a daily practice you could do, or a weekly practice you could do. So like, for example, a daily practice is that you could actually just use these feelings cards to map how you're feeling on that day as you wake up, and then figure out, using these practice cards, if there's anything that you need to include in your day to help with how you're feeling that day. Because I don't know about you, but when I met my well-being plan, that's kind of like, we're talking about ideal state and we're talking about low state, but there's heaps of states in between. So on any given day, I might be somewhere in the middle. And so it's okay for me to have like a new reflection on a daily basis. Or you could also do it weekly, where you look ahead at the week ahead of you and go, well, my week looks like it's got quite a few stressful activities in it, so therefore I need to proactively put into my calendar some of these nice things for myself, because often we only think about that after. So if we do it in advance, then we can often prevent things like long-term burnout or things like that if we're a little bit more proactive. Yeah, so lots of ways.
Yeah. The game development industry, one of the words I hear most often is that it's full of crunch culture. And it's not only just the games industry. There are many industries out there that suffer from the same types of influences, to use one of your words from your text.
Yeah.
How can we, let me just hear from you, your thoughts on crunch culture and the ways that senior leaders can be trying to prevent that or reacting to it for their team.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I've been around a lot of crunch culture. I've worked in the VFX industry and I've also worked in games industry, and I've also seen really good ways of managing this. But I think on reflection, I think the biggest, the first thing, maybe the biggest thing, is that we actually have to acknowledge that that's happening, and we also have to set ourselves we have to acknowledge whether we're actually okay with that or not, because I think there's a real huge part in this which we don't talk about, which is, are we okay with this? Because if we're a senior leadership team and we're noticing that our teams are in crunch and we're letting them work ridiculous hours, they're getting burnt out, their well-being's affected, if we're honest with ourselves, are we actually okay with that? And if we're okay with it, are we encouraging that? If we're not okay with it, then there's heaps we can do. There's heaps of stuff you can do, right? There's a million ideas. But if we're actually okay with this, that's a whole other kettle of fish. We've got to sit down and think to ourselves as senior leaders. If I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, the game is due at this time, and therefore everyone has to do whatever it takes to get there, and I'm okay with it, and I see the impacts on that staff, I probably need to have a little bit more of a think about my own humanity a little bit, because I just think, to be totally honest, shipping a game on time when there's other levers you can pull to change that, and putting your team under huge amounts of stress and affecting their lives, but not only their lives, their families' lives, their communities' lives, and being okay with that, it really doesn't sit comfortably with me, and I don't think it ought to sit comfortably with anybody. I think there are times at work when there might be something where we do a little bit of overtime, or a bit of overtime here to do something. But some of this crunch culture is nothing that, we're not talking little bits of overtime. We're talking about extreme amounts of overtime that is absolutely affecting people in such a negative way. And I saw this when I, worked in the VFX industry. The effects are huge. And every person, like I used to go to, this is just a little side story, but I used to go to a doctor's practice near this VFX place. And the minute I said I was feeling stressed, they're like, I bet you work at this place. And I was like, that's interesting. And they proceeded to tell me that every single person they see from that place is experiencing burnout. And I'm like, that is interesting, right? That is not cool. That is absolutely not cool. And so we've changed that a lot. There's been a lot of even that place that I'm speaking about has changed a significant amount of their culture. But that's the first question we have to ask ourselves, is where do we morally, ethically, as humans stand on this? If you've decided that you are not okay with that and that you'd like to minimize it, I've seen companies do things like, if they're already in the middle of something and there's a deadline, they push back on the agreement. They go back to the people who are publishing it and they go, hey, all the different platforms, and they go, hey, actually, we're going to need some additional time here. And actually, most of the time that has been fine, but you have to have some courage to do that. And or they pause and stop and reflect and go, actually, what do we need to do? Do we need to hire some more people to help with this? Long term, to change the actual whole culture, they've changed the way in which they approach planning projects. They put a lot more buffer time in for people's well-being, for whatever else might be coming up in that particular workplace that is actually costing time. Realistically planning is one of the best things you can do, because we're always optimistically planning, and that's why we get in these positions. And another thing is like not rewarding overtime. What I mean by that is like making a policy so that actually overtime is not encouraged at all. And if you do go overtime, I'm not saying don't pay people who go overtime, but it's more like we are not going to go overtime. And if you're going to go overtime, you need to check in. There's so many policies and practices you can have around your expectations of how people are going to be. But fundamentally, underneath all of that is whether your senior leaders are behind that vision. If they're all sitting there going, hey, no, crunch culture's got to stop, I know for sure that they're smart enough, their team is smart enough to figure out a way forward so that they don't need to be in crunch all the time. So if there is an issue there, it's usually because someone's actually just not motivated to change, which is part of the problem, well, the biggest problem. Yeah. Does that even answer the question? Yeah.
It answers a lot of questions, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful, wonderful insight. So talking about burnout, what are which is what you started at the beginning of all of this, what are the early signs of burnout that we should be looking for, both in our teams, in our colleagues, and in ourselves?
I think everyone's a little bit different. Certainly for me, what I noticed was that I would say my ability to act within my values was compromised. And that's probably one of the first things. So for example, I would stop. One of the first things to leave is an inability to stop being curious, or to be, sorry, an inability to be curious. I think when a lot of people get burnout, a lot of their functions are now spent on the basics. So we start seeing them not being as collaborative, creative, not being able to problem solve very well, brain fog, things where like you go, why am I reacting in a way that's different? Or why, when this situation comes up, I'm normally able to manage that super easy, but I'm feeling very emotional about it. It's a change in the way in which we act. And so if you see someone else and you know to them to be a very patient and understanding and empathetic person, and they're snapping in a meeting, I would definitely be asking questions. That may not be burnout, but it's definitely worth asking questions about. But for me, burnout is just the absolute, like, it's the end result of a sustained amount of overwork and or stress, and or probably other things. I'm not really a burnout expert, but I know that it's an accumulation of a lot of stuff. So things start shutting down is how I like to think of it. It's like just your normal ways of being, or your best ways of being, start being turned off, and you start becoming almost a different type of person, or just being just very different to your usual self. So I think those are the sort of signs I look out for these days. I think there's also things like just physical symptoms about being tired, feeling very unmotivated to get out of bed, and things like that, that you'll start noticing that you might find yourself in a little bit more like pain, or like chronic, if you've got any chronic pain, you might notice more flare-ups of that and stuff like that. So those are the main things, but I think like it's so prevalent, and I think we can't often see it in ourselves because we're in fight or flight kind of mode, where we're just like, go, let's get the bare minimum done. But it's when you're thinking, let's get the bare minimum done, and you're not having any joy in your day, that you might want to stop and go, hang on a minute, I might need a break, and I might need to change some things. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. I think they're really good points to have in the back of your mind, because it's burnout can be, and I've been there a couple of times myself, burnout can be a really long, dragged out process of getting yourself back to even 80%, not even thinking about being 100%.
Oh, totally. Someone said to me the other day that burnout recovery is something like 1.5 times as long as the time that you spent in that stress period.
Wow.
And so I was burnt out over Christmas actually, and like I took 2 months off work, and everyone comes back, and I come back to work and everyone's like, oh, so you must be feeling so much better and ready to go. And I'm like, I am still in recovery for burnout, and I might be for another year. And that's okay, you know, like well, it's not okay, but that's the process. That's why it's so serious, is that it takes a significant amount of time to cut with.
So, Tamara, this has been really, really interesting. Thank you so much for your candidness about mental health. And it's something that I personally would like to see more people be more comfortable in saying. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way as well. So the wellbeing deck you mentioned before, you can buy it as a set of cards, or you can download it and print it yourself. There's about 40 odd pages in it, isn't there? So depending on whether you're printing it out and taking it to warehouse stationery or someone, it might actually be cheaper to buy the deck.
It might be.
But tell us.
Well, you can find it at ridersandelephants.com, and if you select the cards menu, you'll see the wellbeing deck in there. If you click on that, it'll take you right through to the right place. So you can buy it there and download it. I also think I don't know if this is a very good, smart business move at all, but I would really also encourage you that if this is not the right tool, there's still the premise and the purpose of this is still something you can do in many different forms. And I never want access to things like PDFs and printing them or buying a deck to be prohibitive. I never want money or access to certain things to get in the way of us doing wellbeing planning. So it's really important to me that I also say, take the general vibe of what we've just talked about today as well, and you can also do that on your own. This is a good tool to help you do it in a structured way, but the main point is just to do it, just to talk about your well-being. So